Cormac Brennan opened his eyes and the first thing he saw was a ceiling full of plastic stars. Little glow-in-the-dark ones. The kind you buy in a bag at the drugstore. Stuck up there in crooked rows by somebody's hand. That ceiling wasn't his, neither was the bed. Somebody had taken his shoes off and set them by the door, laces tucked neatly inside, and for a long moment the most powerful man in South Boston just lay there staring up at a fake sky, trying to remember how he'd ended up underneath it. Cormac was 34. He'd run his father's territory since he was 21. 7 men called him boss, and nobody in that neighborhood had heard him raise his voice in 13 years. Because a man who has to shout has already lost the room. He'd woken up in plenty of strange places. He'd never once woken up scared. The woman in the doorway was holding 2 cups of coffee. Small, tired, hair pulled back in a hurry, hands cracked raw from dishwater. She looked at him the way you'd look at something lost that had wandered into your kitchen. Careful, not afraid of him, and that was the part that didn't make sense. Before you panic, she said. Nothing happened. You went down on the sidewalk outside my work. I live closer than the hospital. Cormac started to sit up. She set the coffee down, folded her arms, and said the rest of it flat, the way you'd read something off a receipt. Last night you stood up in front of 40 of your men and told them I was under your name. Then you got down on one knee in the middle of the floor. She waited a beat, and I said yes. He didn't move. Somewhere under the pounding in his skull, he could hear it coming back to him, the room going quiet, 40 men not breathing, and his own voice saying something he'd never said sober to anybody in his life. He looked at her again and asked the only question he had left. Why would you say yes to a man like me? And the answer she gave him wasn't the one he'd braced for. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't money. And by the time she finished saying it, Cormac Brennan couldn't get a single word out. If stories like this one are why you're here, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps us more than you'd think. Share it with somebody who could use a good story tonight. And if you're new around here, subscribe and stay with us, because we've got plenty more coming. Now let's go back to that 3rd-floor apartment, to the plastic stars on the ceiling, and to the answer that took a man like Cormac Brennan apart. Faye didn't answer at once. She picked up the coffee pot and poured more into his cup, even though he hadn't taken a single sip, then set the pot down on the table with a soft sound, as though she needed something to do with her hands before she could do something with her mouth. Cormac sat on the edge of the bed, his bare feet resting on the cold wooden floor, and he realized that the room was so small it held only the bed, a low dresser, and just enough space for one person to pass through. On the dresser sat a box of colored pencils and a hair clip. He didn't ask whom they belonged to. Do you want the honest answer, or the comforting one? She said. Both are true, but they aren't the same. I didn't come here for the comforting one. You didn't come here. You were brought here. There was no sharpness in the way she said it. She merely sounded as though she were correcting a detail on a statement, and Cormac fell silent because she was right. Faye pulled out the only chair in the room, but she didn't sit down. She stood behind it with both hands resting on the back and gazed through the window, where the snow was melting into dirty water along the edge of the roof. I'd seen you once before, she said. Before last night, before the 2 years you spent sitting at table 6. He looked up. At the diner? No, not at the diner. She slowly shook her head. Somewhere else. On another night. Back when you were nobody anymore. There was something in the way she spoke those final words that made the pain in Cormac's head retreat by a step. For 13 years, people had spoken to him in 3 kinds of voices. The voice of fear, the voice of flattery, and the voice of someone trying to hide something. He could tell all 3 apart within 3 sentences. This woman's voice belonged to none of them. It sounded like the voice of someone reciting something she had written in her mind long ago and had merely been waiting for the day when she could finally say it aloud. What night? He asked. It doesn't matter. It matters to me. No. She turned to look at him. It never mattered to you. That's the problem. He wanted to stand, but the dizziness pinned him to the edge of the bed for one more moment. And within that moment, he had time to notice her hands resting on the back of the chair, the skin across her fingertips split open, an old cut running along the base of her thumb. They were the hands of someone who had spent years working with hot water and soap. He had seen those hands set a cup of coffee in front of him hundreds of times, yet he had never once looked up from the cup. I stayed silent that night, Faye said. I stood there and didn't say a word, and then morning came, and I went to work, and life simply moved on. I've thought about it more than you imagine, She picked up the dish towel, draped over the back of the chair, folded it in half, then opened it again. Last night, when you knelt in the middle of that floor filled with your people, I looked down and saw the same man I'd seen that night. Not anyone's boss, just a man with nowhere left to go. She paused, and I didn't want to stay silent a second time. Cormac heard the heater inside the wall shudder to life, then fall quiet again. He had sat in rooms with 4 armed men, and never felt his heart quicken by so much as a single beat. Now it was pounding, and he didn't know what to call the feeling. "You said you remember me," he said, "but I don't remember you, so you owe me a name and a night." "I don't owe you anything." The words fell between them, flat and clean, without the slightest trace of anger clinging to them. Faye glanced at the clock hanging above the kitchen doorway, then took off her sweater and reached for the thin coat hanging behind the door. "I have a morning shift," she said. "The coffee in the pot will stay hot for about half an hour. Your shoes are by the door. If you go out, please close the door quietly." She buttoned her coat, and before stepping outside, she stopped for a moment on the threshold without turning around. "You don't remember me," she said, "but I remember you, and I remember why." The moment the door closed, Cormac rose to his feet, though he had to steady himself against the bed frame for a moment before stepping into the living room. The apartment was smaller than his bedroom back home. There was a dining table pushed against the wall, 2 mismatched chairs, a sofa covered with a blanket, and on the windowsill stood a small potted plant that someone had set upright after it had fallen over. Soil still clung to the wooden ledge, and a broken leaf lay beside it, not yet picked up. He looked at it longer than necessary. On the table was a book of signs lying open face down, and beside it sat a hardcover notebook with a piece of worn pencil tied to it by a string. He was bending down to pick up the broken leaf when the door to the next room opened. He turned, and in that moment, Cormac Brennan found himself under the gaze of the smallest and calmest creature he had encountered all morning. The little girl stood in the doorway, her hair tangled on one side, wearing pajamas printed with moons. She studied him from head to toe, slowly and carefully, with the assessing gaze of someone taking inventory. She didn't cry out. She didn't step back. She didn't run to find her mother. She merely tilted her head, raised both hands, and made a precise series of movements in the air. Her fingers opened and closed. Then one hand touched her chin before lowering again. Cormac stood motionless. He knew 4 languages well enough to conduct business at the docks. He could hear a lie over the telephone. He could tell that a man was preparing to betray him simply by the way that man held a glass. Yet he didn't understand a single word this child was saying. The little girl waited. When he didn't answer, she released a long, patient sigh, the kind an adult gave when forced to explain something obvious for a second time. Then she walked straight to the table, pulled the notebook toward her, untied the pencil from its string, and began to write. She wrote slowly, the tip of her tongue protruding slightly from one corner of her mouth, her concentration absolute. Then she tore her eyes from the page, turned the notebook around, and held it up before his face. "You knocked over Mom's plant. Mom said it was all right, but Mom was lying." Cormac read it. Then he read it again. And then something burst from his chest, brief and dry, a sound he didn't immediately recognize until it had already escaped his mouth. He laughed. It wasn't the kind of laugh he used at the dinner table with people who needed reassurance. It was a laugh that broke free on its own, before he had time to decide whether he ought to laugh at all. The little girl raised an eyebrow, plainly satisfied, then turned to a fresh page, wrote again, and held it up. "What's your name? You can't sit in my chair." He took the pencil she offered him, and for 1 second, he thought about the fact that he was leaning over a child's notebook to write down his name, like a man applying for a job. He wrote, "Cormac, which chair is yours?" The little girl pointed to the chair with the cushion, climbed onto it, crossed her legs, and made another brief sign with an expression of great seriousness. Once again, he shook his head. She wrote, "I'm Nell. You should learn. Mom says grown-ups learn slowly, but they can learn." Cormac sat in the remaining chair, the one without a cushion, and for a stretch of time whose length he couldn't quite measure, the most powerful man in South Boston sat in a kitchen on the 3rd floor, his awkward, unaccustomed hands struggling to imitate the shape of a letter, while a child of 6 shook her head and adjusted each of his fingers as though bending a stubborn piece of wire. She wrote, "Wrong," in the notebook 3 times. On the 4th attempt, she drew a crooked, smiling face beside the word and turned the notebook around for him to see, and Cormac nodded like a man who had just been awarded a medal. Then footsteps sounded on the stairs. The door opened, and Faye stood there with the shoulders of her thin coat still wet. She looked at the two of them sitting at the table. She looked at the notebook. Then she glanced behind her, down toward the foot of the stairs, where the small window on the landing offered a view of two men in dark coats standing across the street, neither smoking nor speaking, simply standing there. Nell ran over and wrapped her arms around her mother's leg. Faye rested a hand on the child's head for a moment, made a quick and tender sign, then gently guided her toward the bedroom. Only after the bedroom door had closed did she speak. Her voice remained as level as it had been that morning, but something beneath it had hardened into ice. Take back what you said last night. Do it in front of the very people who heard you say it. Before Cormac could answer, she continued, and tell your men to leave that sidewalk before dark. They're there to watch over you. You think you've protected me. She removed her coat, hung it on a hook, then turned and looked directly into his eyes. But in this neighborhood, carrying your name doesn't mean being protected. It means being marked. You didn't give me a shield. You painted a target on my back. He didn't answer her. He walked to the door, slipped his feet into the shoes someone had neatly arranged the night before, and before descending the stairs, he paused for a moment without turning around and said that his men would be gone from that sidewalk before dark. He made no promise about the declaration he had made. When he reached the street, he gave a single nod toward the other side, and the two figures standing there walked away without a word. The car carried him west, through the warehouse district, and stopped outside a laundromat with a neon sign whose missing letter had been burned out since his father's time. This was where the Brennan men brought their ledgers every Thursday night. Cormac walked past the row of turning dryers, pushed open the wooden door at the back, and all 7 men in the room rose at once. There were enough chairs for everyone. Not one man sat down. They waited until he pulled out his chair, until he took his seat, until he placed both hands on the table, and only then did the chairs begin scraping across the concrete floor. Des stood in the corner with his arms folded across his chest, never sitting, just as he had for all those years. The men delivered their reports one by one. Cormac listened without taking notes. He had never taken notes. His father had taught him that anything a man had to write down in order to remember could also be read by someone else, and Cormac had kept that habit unchanged since he was 21. When the 5th report came, Fitzy stood. Fitzy had worked for the family since Cormac's father was alive, since the days when Cormac had still been a boy sent out to buy cigarettes. He had large hands, a heavy gait, and a habit of clearing his throat before speaking that everyone in the room knew by heart. The previous summer, Cormac had sat at the second table at the wedding of Fitzy's daughter, shaken the groom's hand, and left behind an envelope without saying a word. Fitzy placed a stack of papers on the table, cleared his throat, and began reporting the collections from 3 locations to the south. He spoke longer than necessary. He explained the weather, a store that had closed, and a man who had paid late. When he stopped, the final figure was short by a portion of what it had been the month before, but he didn't mention what was missing. He left it lying silently among his words like a stone covered with leaves. No one in the room moved. Cormac didn't look at the papers. He looked at Fitzy's face and asked his first question. "How long have you worked for my family?" Fitzy answered, and his voice was still normal, even touched with warmth, as he mentioned Cormac's father and winters long gone. Cormac let him finish. Then he asked the second question. "So you think I don't count?" Everyone in the room could hear the steady turning of the dryers outside. Fitzy opened his mouth, then closed it. He began a sentence, but it broke apart halfway through. He raised a hand and loosened his collar. The man seated beside him shifted his chair slightly away, no more than an inch, just enough that they were no longer touching. Cormac remained still, both hands resting on the table, and he didn't lean forward at all. He asked the third question. "Here, or out in the hallway?" Fitzy didn't answer. He stood there in a room with 7 men who didn't dare look at him, the back of his shirt dark with a broad patch of sweat even though the temperature outside was below freezing. He lowered his eyes to his hands, those large hands that had served this family longer than the man sitting before him had been alive, and he couldn't say a word. Cormac allowed the silence to endure long enough for everyone in the room to remember it. Then, in the same voice he used to ask for more coffee, he said, "Don't come back tomorrow." No one touched Fitzy. No door was slammed. He bent down and picked up his papers with fingers that no longer obeyed him, then set them down again because they no longer belonged to him. He walked out past the row of turning dryers, and the laundromat door closed behind him with almost no sound. By the following morning, his name would have disappeared from every ledger, every list, and every greeting exchanged on the street. No one would beat him. People would simply stop seeing him. In this neighborhood, that was what a man feared most. After the door had closed, the remaining 5 men continued their reports, and every voice became shorter, cleaner, and more precise. Cormac remained seated in exactly the same position. He hadn't raised his voice once in 13 years, and his father, the man who had fallen in the middle of a parking lot one Tuesday morning, had once told him only one thing about it, a sentence Cormac repeated silently every Thursday night as he walked past the row of dryers, that the man who had to shout was the man who had already lost control of the room before he ever opened his mouth. Only after the other 5 men had gone, and the back room of the laundromat held no one but the 2 of them, did Des leave his corner. He placed a tablet on the table, turned the screen toward Cormac, and remained standing. "You should see this before someone else does," he said. "Who recorded it?" "No one recorded it." Des touched the screen. "That's the point." The image appeared in a wide, slightly tilted frame looking down from above, the kind of angle only one sort of machine could produce. Cormac immediately recognized the counter, the old cash register, the pastry stand with its plastic cover, and above it all, the small eye that watched and recorded everything, the Blue Hour's security camera. He looked at Des. Des shrugged. "I got it because I knew how to ask. Someone else could ask, too." Cormac said nothing. He watched the screen. The diner was nearing closing time. Faye moved alone between the tables with a coffee pot in one hand, lifting chairs onto the tables in the farthest section. Then the door opened, and his men poured inside, nearly 40 people carrying the smell of liquor and winter with them, filling every table in less than a minute. Cormac watched himself enter last, unbutton his coat, and sit in his usual place. On the screen, he didn't look drunk at all. He still sat with his back straight, still nodded at the proper moments, still looked like the man everyone knew controlled the room. There was only one unusual detail, something only he noticed as he watched it again. He didn't look at anyone. For nearly a quarter of an hour in the recording, he never once looked into the face of any person sitting around him. Then, Faye approached. She leaned forward to pour coffee into his cup, and as she did, something small fell from her apron pocket onto the floor. The camera caught it as a point of light that rolled once before coming to rest beside the leg of his chair. Faye didn't notice. She had already moved to another table. On the screen, Cormac bent down and picked it up. He held it in his palm. He turned it over. Then he sat motionless for a long time, so long that the man beside him finally touched his shoulder. The man watching now wondered what he had been thinking in that moment, but he couldn't find the answer because the liquor had erased that part of his memory. All that remained was the image of himself sitting with his head bowed, staring at a tiny glow in the dark plastic star in his hand, as though he were looking at something that had been returned to him from a great distance. Then he stood. There was no sound in the recording, but he didn't need sound. He saw the entire room turn toward him. He saw the laughing men stop laughing. He saw Faye freeze in the middle of the aisle with the coffee pot in her hand. He saw his own lips move. And he knew exactly what he had said, because the words had been crawling back through his mind since morning like something that refused to die. "She is the only person in this city who ever sat beside me without wanting anything." No one in the room understood what those words meant. It was clear on the screen, in the glances passing between them, in the man who opened his mouth and then thought better of it. Only one person understood, and she was standing in the aisle, the hand holding the coffee pot slowly lowering to her side. Then Cormac went down on one knee in the middle of the diner floor, dressed in his dark suit and surrounded by nearly 40 people who worked for him, and held up a plastic star bought at a drugstore. Des touched the screen and paused the recording on that exact frame. "Do you want me to turn it off?" he asked. "No." Cormac stared at the frozen image. He had looked at himself in the mirror every morning for 13 years, and had never once seen anything unfamiliar. Now, he was looking at a man he didn't know. That man was kneeling on the floor of a diner, his shoulders slightly bowed and his face turned upward, and there wasn't a trace of defense on that face. There was none of the expression before which the 7 men in this room had lowered their heads half an hour earlier. There was nothing at all. He was merely a man looking up at someone and waiting. "How much did I drink?" he asked. "Not enough to do that," Des said. "I was standing right there, kid. You weren't staggering. You weren't slurring your words. You said that sentence more clearly than anything you've said to me in the past 3 years. Des picked up the tablet, turned off the screen, and held it in his hand. Liquor can't invent words like that. It only takes the lid off. The next morning, Cormac called the man who managed the ledgers and gave him a name. He didn't explain why. In the Brennan family, when the boss gave someone a name, no one asked questions. He said only that he wanted to know everything about the debt hanging over that woman's shoulders, beginning with the very first line, and that he wanted the original documents, not a summary. By afternoon, a cardboard box had been placed on his desk. He closed the office door, turned off his phone, and sat down with it. The box wasn't thick. That was the first thing that disturbed him. An entire life had been turned upside down, yet all of it fit neatly inside a box thinner than a telephone book. The first page was the original loan agreement, signed many years earlier in the name of a man called Wesley Ford. The loan wasn't large, set beside the figures Cormac approved every week. It was the sort of amount no one would bother looking at twice. The purpose of the loan had been written by hand by the clerk who received the application. 3 words. Medical equipment purchase. Beneath that was a smaller line explaining that the equipment was intended for a child. Cormac read the line, set the page down, then picked it up and read it again. The second page was a record stating that the borrower had ceased all communication. The third was an internal note, written with brutal brevity. Borrower has left the state. The fourth was a copy of a death certificate issued in another state, several days' drive from Boston. And the fifth was what left him sitting motionless for a very long time. It wasn't a contract. It was a typed page of internal policy, with a title, a clause number, and a signature in the lower right corner. His signature. The policy was so brief that it took less than half a minute to read. The debt of a deceased borrower would pass to the borrower's direct heir. No reassessment of the heir's ability to pay. No consideration of circumstances. No exceptions. Cormac stared at his signature. He knew those strokes of ink better than he knew his own face. He also knew exactly when the signature had been placed there, because the upper left corner bore a date stamp, and that date fell during the week after they buried Rory. He remembered that week. He didn't remember it in details. He remembered it the way a person remembers a fever. He remembered sitting in this room while someone had brought in a thick stack of papers and told him that everything was routine, that they needed only his signature to keep the machinery running. He remembered signing them, all of them, from the first page to the last without reading a single line, because that week he hadn't read anything, hadn't listened to anyone, hadn't eaten more than 2 meals, and the only thing he had been capable of doing was keeping his hand steady enough for his signature to look like it belonged to a man who was still in his right mind. He had believed that week had destroyed no one but him. He arranged the pages in order by date, and once they lay in a straight line across the desk, the truth revealed itself with merciless clarity. When he signed that clause, the woman named Faye Winslow was still living a stable life. She worked, she cared for her child, and although her husband had left, the debt remained in that man's name and had nothing to do with her. The trap had been set one afternoon without her knowledge by a man she had never met, in a room only a few miles from her home. Then, months later, in a distant state, a man died in an accident, and the trap closed. No one pressed a button, no one gave an order. The clause simply did exactly what it had been written to do, and it dropped the entire debt onto the back of a woman of 23 who was raising a small child. Cormac Brennan had ruined her life without being deliberately cruel to her for even a second. He had ruined it because he hadn't bothered to look down at the page before putting his pen to it. He sat there for a very long time. Then he pulled the final document from the box, the one he hadn't yet read, an asset statement connected to the address the borrower had once registered. It was merely routine paperwork, a single page listing the owner of the building. He read the name of the company that held the title. Then he opened a drawer and took out the directory of the family's shell companies, the directory he had signed over entirely to his mother after his brother's funeral, because he no longer wanted anything to do with the legitimate, spotless, brightly lit side of the Brennan family. He ran his finger down the list. The name was there, halfway down the page, neither highlighted nor marked. The building with the blue hour on the ground floor, the 3 floors of rental apartments above it. For 2 years, every Thursday night, he had eaten beneath his own roof without knowing it, and yesterday morning, he had awakened in a bed inside an apartment his family owned, beneath a ceiling covered with plastic stars, and lain there wondering where he was. He drove to the family home that same evening. carrying the list folded into quarters in the inside pocket of his coat. The house stood at the end of a quiet street, 3 stories tall, with a steep roof and high windows, the kind of house his father had bought with money that had never been declared. Cormac walked through the long hallway leading to the living room, and as always, he didn't look at the walls on either side. There was nothing on those walls, only pale yellow wallpaper and small nails no one had bothered to pull out, each one marking the place where a framed photograph had once hung. During the 3 days after the funeral, Cormac himself had gone from room to room, taking down every picture, wrapping each one, and carrying it to the basement. He had done it alone, at night, without telling anyone. He had called it strength. Maeve was sitting at the dining table, with a stack of bills and a pen in front of her. She didn't look up when he entered. She waited until he pulled out a chair and sat across from her, then set down her pen, removed her glasses, and looked at her son. "Have you eaten?" she asked. "I didn't come here to eat." "Then you came to ask me something you already know the answer to." Cormac took the folded paper from his pocket, opened it on the table, and pushed it toward her. Maeve put her glasses back on. She read it slowly, tracing the lines with her finger. She didn't appear surprised. "I know that building," she said. "I've managed it ever since you handed everything over to me. You told me to do whatever I wanted and not ask you about it. I want to know who lives on the 3rd floor. A woman and a little girl. The rent is always paid on time. They've never been late once." Maeve folded the paper along its original creases. "What else do you want me to say? I don't go knocking on every door to ask people how they live." Cormac didn't answer. He told her about the cardboard box, the agreement bearing the name of a man who had died in another state, and the 3 words written by hand by the clerk who received the application. Then he told her about the policy page with his signature in the lower right corner and the date stamp from that very week. He spoke in an even voice, the voice he used when reporting facts to himself, and when he finished, his mother was sitting perfectly still with her hands folded one over the other on the table. Then Maeve spoke. Her voice wasn't any louder than before, but there was something in it that made him straighten his back like a little boy. "Your father had one rule," she said. "Only one, and he never wrote it down anywhere. The Brennan family doesn't take money from widows. Not because he was kind. He wasn't kind. He said it was because that kind of money never stays still. It follows you all the way home to your own front door." She removed her glasses again and placed them on the table. "I kept that rule for 40 years. I kept it even through the years when our family had nothing. Then you signed a piece of paper you couldn't be bothered to read, and that rule died in a single afternoon. I didn't know. I know you didn't know." Maeve looked directly into his eyes. "That's the point, Cormac. You aren't cruel. I gave birth to you, and I know you aren't cruel. You simply don't look." She rose, walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and placed it before him even though he hadn't asked for it. She stood there with one hand gripping the back of the chair and continued, her voice growing hoarse this time. "You did exactly the same thing to Rory." Cormac looked up. It had been 3 years since anyone in this house had spoken that name aloud in his presence. "You kept your brother out of everything," Maeve said. "Out of the ledgers, out of the meetings, out of every room behind every closed door in this house. You thought you were protecting him, but you never asked whether he wanted to be kept out. You didn't ask him once in his entire life. Then you called it love." The refrigerator began humming in the kitchen, then fell silent again. Cormac looked down at the glass of water before him and didn't touch it. "Mom," he said, "I'm not finished." Maeve turned her eyes toward the empty wall behind her son, where a framed photograph of 2 boys standing on the front porch during some distant summer had once hung. "You carried every picture of him down to the basement in 3 days," she said. "You thought I didn't know. I was lying upstairs, listening to you walk through the house all night." She picked up her pen, sat down, and pulled the stack of bills toward her. "If you want to fix something, then go and fix it. But this time, look carefully before you do." He came to the diner at noon the following day, not on Thursday night, and it was the first time in 2 years that he had entered the blue hour outside those familiar hours. The place was crowded. There was the smell of hot grease, the clatter of dishes, and a row of people seated along the counter, hurrying through lunch. The moment he pushed open the door, the conversation dropped by a degree. It didn't stop entirely. It merely lowered, the sound of a room that had just recognized the person who had entered. Someone was sitting at table 6. Cormac stopped in the middle of the aisle. Ruthie Kaminsky came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. and walked straight toward him without hesitation or a polite smile. She blocked the entrance to the kitchen with her whole body, a woman a full head shorter than he was, and looked up at him. "She's working," Ruthie said. "I only need to say one thing to her. You've said enough." Her voice didn't tremble. "You've known this diner for years. I've served you properly, and I've never asked what you do. But that girl works 3 jobs a day and gets only a few hours of sleep. I won't let you turn her 4th job into cleaning up after you." A dishcloth struck the counter with a soft slap. Faye came out from the back, still holding the cloth, her apron tied crookedly at one side, and placed a hand on Ruthie's shoulder. "Go back inside," she said. "Faye, go back inside." Ruthie looked at her for a long moment, then turned away. But she didn't go all the way into the kitchen. She merely retreated to the doorway and remained there. Faye stepped in front of Cormac. In this neighborhood, people had learned not to look directly at him. They looked down, glanced aside, or watched his hands instead of meeting his eyes. The woman standing before him now barely reached his shoulder, still held a wet dishcloth in one hand, and stared straight into his eyes without blinking. "Table 6 is still yours," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but the diner had fallen silent, and within that silence, an ordinary voice rang as clearly as a bell. "Coffee still costs the same. If you want to come on Thursday nights, then come. I'll pour it for you just as I have all these years." She shifted the cloth to her other hand. "But if your men stand outside my home for one more night, I'll call the police, and I'll give them your name, your full name. We both know what happens after that." Someone seated at the counter set down a fork very softly. No one chewed. No one poured. The crowded lunchroom stood frozen like a photograph. And at the center of that photograph was a waitress, speaking to the most powerful man in the neighborhood, in the same tone someone might use with a plumber who had arrived late. "You choose," Faye said. Cormac didn't move. He could feel every eye in the diner. He knew exactly what people were committing to memory, and he knew that by afternoon, the story would have traveled through all of South Boston. In 13 years, no one had ever done this to him. No one had dared. And he knew something else, something that weighed heavily on his chest. If she did exactly what she had just threatened to do, he wouldn't be the one who suffered. He had lawyers. She had a child of 6 and an apartment on the 3rd floor. She was placing the only thing she had left on the table to gamble, and she did it with perfect calm, like setting a plate before a customer. "They're gone," he said. "Since last night." Faye watched him for another moment. Then she nodded once, turned, and walked toward the kitchen. As she passed Ruthie, she said something so softly that only then did the older woman finally agree to go inside. The clatter of dishes gradually returned. Someone at the far end of the counter laughed a little too loudly, the laugh of a person trying to break the silence. Cormac remained there for one more second, then turned toward the door. Outside, the wind cut across his face. His car was parked a few steps away, and the driver had already opened the rear door. But the driver didn't get into the car immediately. He lingered with one hand holding the door and spoke quietly, his eyes still fixed straight ahead. "There's been a car parked across the street since early this morning. It's not from this neighborhood." Cormac didn't turn around. "What else?" "Someone in Charlestown has been asking about you, asking where you eat and which night you go there." Cormac glanced across the street once, very quickly, then bent down and entered the car. "All right," he said. That was all he said. It took him 2 days. Not because it was difficult, but because he wanted it done cleanly. He called the man who managed the loan portfolio and said he wanted to buy out one debt, exactly one, with his own money, and he wanted the documents to state clearly that from the date of signing, the borrower would no longer owe anything to anyone. The man on the other end of the line fell silent for a moment, then repeated the request to make certain he had understood, because no Brennan boss had ever used his own money to purchase a debt and then tear it up. Cormac repeated his instructions in exactly the same words. He understood the limits of what he was doing. There were thousands of names in that ledger, and he couldn't touch the ledger itself because it no longer belonged solely to the Brennan family. It had been pledged as security for something else several years earlier, and interfering with it would mean interfering with an entire agreement he wasn't ready to open now. But one isolated debt was different. One isolated debt was only money. To someone else, it was an entire life. To him, it was an afternoon of paperwork. He realized that as he held the authorization in his hand, and it made him feel sick in a way he couldn't quite explain. He went to her apartment on Saturday afternoon. He didn't allow anyone to accompany him, didn't park in front of the building, and walked half a block through the wind. Faye opened the door, but she didn't invite him inside. She stood, blocking the narrow opening, and behind her came the sound of something clattering. On the living room floor, he caught a glimpse of Nell sitting with her legs folded beneath her, stacking wooden blocks into a tower that reached her chin. The little girl looked up, saw him, waved with great enthusiasm, then returned to her tower. Faye drew the door a little closer to the frame. "I have an afternoon shift," she said. "I won't take long." He took an envelope from his coat. He didn't speak first. He merely held it out, and Faye looked at the envelope as though it were something that might bite her. She took it. She opened it. She read. Cormac watched her face as she did, and he saw the realization come in stages. He saw her eyes pass over the first line and stop, then return to the top and begin again. He saw her fingers tighten around the edges of the paper. He saw her shoulders drop slightly without her realizing it. She read the document 3 times. Then she looked up, and there were tears in her eyes. But before he had time to feel relieved, she stepped completely outside the apartment and into the hallway, closing the door behind her so the child inside wouldn't see anything. "This is real," she said. "It's real. I don't owe anyone a single cent anymore. Not just any debt. My debt. Yes, yours." Faye nodded slowly. She looked down at the paper in her hands and remained that way for a long while in the cold hallway that smelled of old paint. Then she took the page in both hands and tore it in half. Cormac didn't move. She tore it again, then again, neither hurriedly nor violently, carefully following the folds as someone might tear up a bill that had already been paid, until all that remained was a handful of scraps in her palm. "I know what you just did," she said. "You did the one thing I haven't dared to dream about all these years. I've spent countless nights sitting at that table with a calculator, adding the numbers again and again, figuring out how many years older I'd be by the time I finished paying it if I took one more shift. You did it in 2 days." Her voice remained level, and it was that very calmness that made it frightening. "And you did it without asking me a single question. I thought you would. You thought." She looked up at him. "Do you know what this feeling is called? It's still having a stranger decide my life for me. It's still sitting at my kitchen table and receiving news about a decision someone else made. The only difference is that this time, the stranger was kind." She opened her palm, and the scraps fell onto the hallway floor, white as fragments of snow against the dirty tile. "Not once in all these years has anyone asked what I wanted," Faye said. "My husband didn't ask. The people who sent the papers didn't ask. And then there was you. You have more power than any of them, and you didn't ask either." She pushed open the door and stepped inside, and before closing it, she added one more sentence. "Pick those up for me. I don't want my little girl seeing scraps of paper in the hallway." He gathered every scrap of paper and put them into his coat pocket, but he didn't go down the stairs. He stood there until the door opened again, and Faye gave him only a glance before turning back inside and leaving the door open. That was the entirety of the invitation he received. Inside, Nell was struggling with a wooden tower that had just collapsed. The moment she saw him, she slapped her palm against the floor twice to summon him, then pointed at the scattered blocks with the expression of a foreman who needed another worker. He removed his coat, sat down on the floor, and while Faye changed in the other room, that man stacked blocks according to the instructions of a child of 6. Whenever he placed one incorrectly, she pushed his hand aside and made him do it again. When the tower reached Nell's shoulders, it collapsed. She threw back her head and laughed without making a sound, her whole body trembling, and Cormac sat watching her laugh until he forgot where he was. Then she scrambled to her feet and ran into the bedroom to fetch her notebook. While she searched, he pressed one hand against the floor to stand, and his hand caught on the handle of the bottom drawer in the low cabinet against the wall. The drawer slid open by a few inches. There were no clothes inside. There was a square cardboard box printed with the image of a smiling baby, and beside it were 2 smaller boxes, still sharp along their original folds. Cormac pulled the drawer farther open. The pair of hearing devices rested neatly in fitted plastic, clean and without a single scratch, their charging cords still tied as they had been when purchased. They looked as though they had been bought the day before. He sat motionless and stared at them for a long time, and a thought formed in his mind that sent a chill down his spine. This was what the loan had purchased, the thing that had set everything that followed into motion. and it had been lying here in a drawer, never used. He thought the child had refused them. He imagined someone trying to make her wear them, and the little girl stubbornly refusing. Faye came out while tying back her hair, then stopped when she saw the open drawer. She didn't become angry. She merely walked over, sat on the edge of the chair, and looked at the box the way someone might look at an old photograph. "They're broken," she said. "They've been broken for a long time. They still look new. Because I kept them carefully. The pieces that go inside the ears wore down over the years, and eventually the amplifiers needed to be replaced. I asked what it would cost. They gave me a figure. I thanked them, and I went home." She gave a very slight shrug. "Then I just left them there. I couldn't bring myself to throw them away." Cormac was about to say something, but she interrupted him, speaking in the voice of someone who had been forced to explain this too many times to too many people, and had grown tired of explaining. "Don't look at that box and think my little girl is missing something. She isn't missing anything." She nodded toward the bedroom. "She attends a good public school for deaf children. She has interpreters, dedicated teachers, and friends her own age. She's at the top of her class in reading. She has a complete language, one rich enough to tell jokes, argue with me, and lie to me when she doesn't want to go to bed. She doesn't need that box to do anything in her life." Faye lowered her eyes to her hands. "I was the one who was missing something," she said. "I was so young back then. I sat in that clinic listening to people talk, and there was only one thought in my head. I had to fix it. I had to fix it no matter what. I thought being a good mother meant I had to fix my child. Then I signed wherever they told me to sign. Then I let my husband take out the loan. Everything that happened afterward began with that one thought." She gently pushed the drawer closed with the toe of her shoe. "There was never anything broken about my little girl. I was the only one who was broken." Nell came running out with the notebook hugged against her chest, and squeezed between the two adults with the expression of someone about to announce important news. She turned page after page after page, passing drawings and crooked lines of writing, then stopped near the middle and held the notebook up before Cormac, pointing at the page with her face glowing. Carefully formed in a child's handwriting, each letter slightly too large for the ruled lines, were the words, "I know how to add money now." Beneath them was a row of addition problems, arranged in neat columns, tiny numbers stacked on top of one another, with lines beneath them and answers below. At the bottom of the page was a smiling face she had drawn to praise herself. Nell tapped the page twice, then pointed proudly at her own chest. Cormac nodded and raised his thumb. She broke into a wide grin, closed the notebook, and ran to show her mother. But he had already seen what the child hadn't seen, and what Faye had never seen either, because to them it was merely a page of schoolwork. Those figures hadn't come from a textbook. They were amounts of loose change. They were small sums added together, arranged in two columns, one column always shorter than the other. A little girl had sat at this very table, watching her mother calculate the same figures again and again every night, and had learned addition from the exact numbers she saw. Cormac stood, put on his coat, and by the time he descended the stairs, he already knew what he was going to do. He would pay for the child's treatment, whatever it cost. The school was in Dorchester, a low red brick building with a playground paved in rubber and a row of bare trees along the fence. Cormac arrived in the middle of the morning wearing a dark coat, and he stood waiting in the hallway like everyone else. The walls were covered with drawings made by the students. It didn't have the noise of an ordinary school, but it wasn't silent either. From behind the classroom door came the scraping of chairs, the sound of running feet, and laughter escaping in bursts of breath. Through the glass panel, he could see an entire class speaking with their hands, more than a dozen children whose hands flew up and down as they interrupted one another and fought to speak, exactly like every other classroom in the world. Miss Bernadette Locke met him in a small room at the end of the hallway. She wore a gray sweater and glasses suspended from a cord, and her handshake was as firm as any man's. Cormac had prepared what he intended to say. He told her he was a friend of the family, that he wanted to cover every expense, that he had already spoken with several places, and was prepared to take the little girl to the finest hospital anywhere, and that money wasn't an issue. When he finished, Miss Locke removed her glasses and let them hang from the cord, then studied him for a long moment before sitting in the chair across from him. "Have you spoken with the child's mother?" she asked. "I intended to do it first and tell her afterward." "Yes." She nodded slowly, the way someone nodded after hearing the same answer many times. People often do that. She pointed toward the classroom door at the far end of the hallway. You just walked past that room. What did you see? The children were talking. Exactly. They were talking. Did you know our Nell is at the top of her reading class? She reads nearly 2 years above her age. She uses a complete language with grammar, figures of speech, and even sarcasm. She can tell jokes. She can argue. If she wants to lie to me, she can do it very smoothly. And there have been days when she has. Miss Locke put her glasses back on. The only thing that child lacks, sir, isn't inside her. It's out there. She lacks people willing to learn her language. She braced her hands on the table. So I'm asking you sincerely, what exactly do you intend to fix? Cormac didn't answer. In 13 years, no one had ever asked him a question for which he didn't already have 3 possible answers. He looked down at his hands, the hands that had signed that clause, the hands that had picked up a plastic star from the diner floor. If you truly want to help, I'll tell you how, Miss, Locke said, her voice becoming much gentler. Our school offers evening classes for parents and relatives. They're free, twice a week. Most people attend a few classes and then quit because they're busy, because they feel embarrassed, or because their hands are too stiff. Would you like to enroll? And that was why, on Tuesday evening of that week, the most powerful man in South Boston sat in a classroom with low tables and small chairs, surrounded by several mothers and a grandfather with silver hair, trying to bend his fingers into the shape of a letter. He did it wrong. He did nearly everything wrong. His hands were accustomed to other things, and now they felt as rigid as a wrench. Miss, Locke walked around the classroom correcting each student, and when she reached him, she said only, "You're signing as though you're threatening someone. Loosen your wrist." The entire class laughed. Cormac laughed too, but his real teacher wasn't in that classroom. She was on the 3rd floor of that apartment building, and she was far stricter. Every afternoon he visited, Nell made him sit at the kitchen table, open the notebook, and take a test. She demonstrated each sign once, very slowly, then folded her arms and waited. He copied her. She shook her head. He tried again. She shook her head, took his hand, folded down his little finger, turned his wrist at an angle, then released him, and gave a brief nod like an elderly schoolteacher. She graded him in the notebook. A correct answer earned a smiling face. A wrong answer earned a crooked one. One afternoon, she drew a smiling face with tears streaming from its eyes and pushed the notebook across the table for her mother to see. Faye stood at the sink with her back turned, her shoulders trembling, and that was the first time Cormac heard her laugh. He learned his first sign the following Thursday evening. It was thank you. He got it right on his 2nd attempt, and Nell widened her eyes as though she had just witnessed a miracle. Then she opened the notebook, drew 3 smiling faces in a row, and held them up for him to see with the generosity of someone who had just decided to grant another person a pardon. The cardboard box was still on his desk, and one night when he couldn't sleep, Cormac took it out again. He wasn't looking for anything. He merely went back through the record of payments, the long statement listing every payment, every month, every line. This time, he looked more closely. There were 2 streams of money. One was steady, deducted directly from wages on the same date and in the same amount every month. That was Faye's. But there was another, smaller and less consistent, paid in cash at the counter, with the payer's name left blank. Some months it appeared, and some months it didn't, but it continued for more than 2 years and never stopped entirely. Cormac called the man who managed the loan portfolio and ordered him to find the original receipts. By the next morning he had his answer. The payer hadn't left a name, but the collection desk had recorded a telephone number to which the receipts could be sent. The number belonged to the Blue Hour. When he had his men investigate further, they uncovered something that forced him to sit down. The diner had been mortgaged. Not recently, a long time ago. That afternoon, he went to the diner after closing. Ruthie was turning the chairs upside down on the tables. She wasn't surprised when she saw him enter. She merely set down the final chair and wiped her hands on her apron. "You found out," she said. It wasn't a question. Cormac placed the document on the counter. Ruthie glanced at it and pushed it aside without bothering to read it. "You mortgaged the entire diner," he said. "I knew what I was doing. Why?" Ruthie removed her apron, folded it, and placed it on the counter. She stood there with both hands braced against the wood, gazing out over the empty diner, and remained silent so long that Cormac thought she wouldn't answer. Then she spoke, and her voice sounded nothing like the one she used when scolding customers. "I fostered her once," she said, "when she was very young. So young that she doesn't remember any of it now." Cormac didn't move. "We took in foster children back then. My husband was still alive. He worked at sea, and I stayed home. The little girl lived with us for several winters." She paused. "Then my husband died. Suddenly, I sat at that table with a whole stack of papers, calculating the numbers again and again. But no matter how I worked them, they wouldn't come out right. I couldn't manage. I called the agency, and they came. And the little girl was moved somewhere else." Ruthie spoke the sentence very slowly, one word at a time, as though she had repeated it silently to herself too many times. Her name went back on the list. After that, she was sent to several other homes. I don't know which ones. Water dripped into the sink in the kitchen. Years later, Ruthie continued, a young woman came in asking for work. She stood exactly where you're standing now. Her belly was already showing. She said she could work the night shift. She said she didn't mind doing anything. Ruthie raised a hand and touched the counter. I recognized her in the first second, the moment she looked up. And Faye? She didn't recognize me. How could she? She had been so young, and I had remarried, changed my last name, and grown 20 years older. Ruthie gave a slight shrug. I hired her. Then I kept quiet. 4 years. 4 years. She nodded. If you want to know why, I can answer that easily. I sent her away once. I wasn't going to do it a second time. Something fell softly near the kitchen doorway. Both of them turned. Faye stood there, still holding a tray, and as the tray tilted, several spoons slid onto the floor. She didn't bend down to pick them up. She remained where she was, staring at the woman behind the counter, her face empty of expression for so long that Cormac could hear his heart beating in his ears. Ruthie didn't approach her. She simply remained behind the counter, with both hands still braced against the wood, and waited, like someone who had been waiting for years and knew how to wait 1 minute longer. You, Faye said. Only one word. Yes, Ruthie answered. Faye placed the tray on the nearest table with great care, as though the entire room would shatter if she set it down too hard. Then she took 3 steps and stopped. Her legs gave way, and she sank onto the kitchen floor with her back against the refrigerator door and both arms wrapped around her knees. She didn't cry aloud. Her shoulders shook in waves as she sat on the same tile floor she had cleaned more times than she could count. Ruthie walked around the counter. She didn't help Faye to her feet. She slowly and painfully lowered herself beside her, an old woman sitting on the cold floor, then slipped an arm around the young woman's shoulders and drew Faye's head against her. All this time, I thought, Faye said into Ruthie's shoulder, her voice strangled. I thought I had done everything alone. You did do it alone, Ruthie said. I only walked behind you. Cormac took 1 step back, then another. He went to the door, closed it very softly behind him, and stood on the cold sidewalk beneath the neon sign with one burned-out letter, his chest burdened by something he wouldn't learn to name until much later. Throughout those 4 years, there had been a woman in this city who had placed her entire diner at risk to carry part of the debt his own family had laid upon someone else's back. 3 days later, Faye asked for the morning off. She didn't tell anyone why. She left Nell with a neighbor on the same floor, put on the best coat she owned, and took 2 buses to the county courthouse. The records room was in the basement, at the end of a hallway that smelled of damp paper and floor wax. Someone gave her a request form, and she sat down to complete it, then had to fill it out a second time because she had marked 1 box incorrectly the first time. She waited 40 minutes. Then someone wheeled out a cart holding 3 file boxes, and she sat at a long table beneath fluorescent lights and began searching. She had looked for this once before, many years earlier, but she had given up because she hadn't known whom to ask and still had 2 work shifts to get to. This time, she had no shift waiting for her. The morning passed. She searched through the first box, then the second, and halfway through the third, she found it. Her own complaint, filed with the State Consumer Protection Agency, typed in a free legal aid office, and signed in the handwriting of a woman much younger than the one she was now. She reread what she had written then. She had listed everything. Interest compounded upon interest, penalties, extension fees, and the debt transfer clause she had never signed. She had been correct. She had written it clearly. She turned to the final page. There was the decision denying her complaint, brief and typed on half a page, with the reason stated in a single line of cold administrative language. The complainant had failed to provide sufficient supporting documents requested in the supplemental notice, and the deadline for submission had expired. Faye sat staring at that sentence for a long time. She remembered the request for additional documents. She remembered calling the attorney assigned to her, calling many times, and being told not to worry, that everything was being handled and there was no cause for concern. She had believed him. She had been 23, raising a small child and working nights, and when a man in a suit told her not to worry, she hadn't worried. In the lower corner of the decision was the name of the legal representative assigned by the court. She requested copies of the entire file, paid the copying fee with coins counted from her wallet, then took 2 buses home. That evening, she called Cormac. It was the first time she had ever called him herself. She said only that she had something he needed to see. He arrived within half an hour. Faye placed the file on the kitchen table, in the very spot where Nell usually sat to test him on his signs, and pushed it toward him. "I once took this to court," she said. "You didn't know about this." Cormac sat down. He read the complaint first. He read slowly, line by line, and his expression didn't change. Then he turned to the decision denying her claim, read the reason, and still showed no change in his face. "They said I didn't submit all the documents," Faye said. "But I did. I gave them to him. I carried the entire envelope to his office myself. I still remember that it was raining that day." Cormac didn't answer. His eyes had moved to the bottom corner of the page, to the line bearing the name of the assigned legal representative. He read the name. Then he read it again. Faye watched him, and she saw something she had never seen on this man's face before. He sat perfectly still. His hands rested on the table, neither clenched nor trembling, but they lay motionless in an unnatural way, like 2 objects that had been set down rather than human hands. "You know him," she said. Cormac didn't answer immediately. He knew the name the way a person knew a line on a payroll sheet. The man wasn't a Brennan family attorney. His name appeared near the bottom of a list among the minor expenses, the sort no one bothered reading aloud during meetings. Payments made to a clerk at the courthouse, someone answering telephones at a government office, or a person who could leave a file untouched in a drawer until its deadline expired. Cormac even knew the figure. It was humiliatingly small. It was less than the dinner bill he had paid at a restaurant on Hanover Street the previous Saturday night. 4 years of the life of the woman sitting before him had been bought for a sum he couldn't even remember approving. "Tell me," Faye said. "He was on my payroll," Cormac said. The kitchen became utterly silent. Faye rose, walked to the sink, turned on the faucet, then turned it off again without washing anything. She stood with her back to him, both hands gripping the edge of the sink. "So from the very beginning," she said, "I never had a chance at all." "No. You can say it that plainly?" "You asked me plainly." Faye remained standing with her back to him at the sink for a long time. Then she wiped her hands on a towel even though they were dry, turned around, and sat in the chair across from him. "I waited for you," she said. "Waited for what?" "To see whether you would go looking for it yourself." She pushed the file aside, clearing a space on the table as though making room for something else that was about to be placed there. "That page with your signature. The clause. I've known about it for a long time. I have a copy in a shoebox under my bed. I could have thrown it in your face that very morning when you woke up here, but I didn't." "Why?" "Because if I gave it to you, you would have read it like a man being accused. I wanted to see whether you would find it on your own." She straightened her back. "You found it. Now I can tell you." Cormac said nothing. Over the past few weeks, he had learned that when this woman began to speak, it was best not to interrupt her. "There was a boy who used to sit at table 6, Faye said. "He stayed very late. Some nights he was still there when I started turning the chairs up onto the tables. He would order coffee and let it grow cold, order pie and leave it untouched. I asked him why he didn't go home, and he said there were too many people in his house." Cormac looked up. "I didn't know who he was," she said. "He never told me. He only said he had an older brother who arranged everything in the world for him, and he didn't know what was left for him to do." The heater inside the wall shuddered to life, then fell silent again. "He sat there for months. Every night I worked the late shift, he was there. We talked. Nothing important. He asked how many months pregnant I was. He said that if the baby was a girl, I should give her a short name, because long names were difficult for children to write." Faye raised a hand and touched the edge of the table. "Then one night, He stayed later than usual. And that was the night I called the ambulance. I went with him to the hospital. I held his hand the entire way there, and I was still holding it when they told me to let go. Silence filled the room for so long that they could hear water dripping into the sink. Cormac sat completely still. He had heard the story of that night from the doctor, the police, Des, and 3 or 4 other people, and not one of those accounts had ever mentioned a woman. They had said only that someone at the diner had called for an ambulance. He had never asked who that person was. I still had to work the following night, Faye said. My shift ended close to dawn. I opened the door to leave, and there was a man sitting on the sidewalk with his back against the wall, directly beneath the broken sign. He was wearing a suit without a coat, and the cold could have cut through skin. She lowered her eyes. I went back inside, poured a cup of coffee, and carried it out. I set it beside him. Then I sat down. You stayed there until morning, Cormac said, his voice hoarse. It wasn't because I was kind to strangers, Faye said. Don't think that. I sat down because I didn't know where else to go either. I had just lost someone I had no right to grieve. I wasn't family. I wasn't allowed at the funeral. I was only the girl who waited tables. She looked up at him. I sat beside you because I was grieving too. I simply wasn't allowed to say it aloud. Cormac raised a hand to his face and held it there for a while. And when you collapsed on the street last week, she continued, I brought you here for the same reason. Not because you're the boss of this neighborhood, because you're his brother. He remembered. That night, he had walked. He couldn't remember which streets he had crossed. And when he awakened on that bed the following morning, all he knew was that he had spent a long time somewhere outside. Months later, when he ordered his men to retrace his brother's final days through his card statements, the name Blue Hour appeared again and again, more often than any other place. Cormac had gone there. He had asked the waitress working that day where the boy usually sat, and someone had pointed to the 6th table from the door. He had sat down there, and he had returned every Thursday night for 2 years, to that exact table, beside that exact sidewalk, in the section served by that exact woman. That table, he said. No one seats customers there on Thursday nights. Faye shrugged. I kept it open. I didn't tell anyone. Then she rose, walked into the bedroom, and returned holding an old photograph taken with a telephone and printed on paper. It showed an envelope. I wrote you a letter, she said. 1 week after the funeral, mug of pages. I wrote down the things he had told me at that table, the things I thought you should know. I took a bus all the way to your house. Someone came out and opened the gate. She placed the photograph on the table. He took the letter. Then he told me that you didn't read letters from strangers. Cormac rose so quickly that his chair fell backward. He drove to the family home, went down to the basement, and dragged out each of the boxes stacked there. The same boxes he had ordered someone to store away 3 years earlier. Letters of condolence, funeral bills, and things he had never opened. He found it in the 3rd box. A white envelope with his name written by hand in a woman's handwriting. Still sealed, never opened. Cormac sank onto the concrete floor among the boxes and opened it. Alone in the basement, beneath the overhead light, he read those 4 pages 3 years after they had been written. On the 3rd page, he stopped at one sentence. In that sentence, she had written down what the boy had told her late one night. He had said he wanted to leave all of it behind, that he had spoken to someone in the family, the only person he had dared to tell, and that person had advised him to keep quiet, tell no one, and not disappoint his older brother. She had also written the name the boy had given her, Des. He didn't tell Faye about the name in the letter. He folded the 4 pages, placed them in the inside pocket of his coat, and for the next 3 days, he worked like a man laying the foundation of a house. He ordered his people to retrieve every personnel file from the lending division, every employment contract, authorization document, confidentiality agreement, and anything else bearing the signature of a man named Arthur Pell. When Cormac called Faye and said he would be going there on Friday morning, she asked only what time. When he told her she didn't need to come, she interrupted him. I'm coming, she said. Not to help you. I want to see his face once in my life. He held my file in his hands all those years, and I never even knew what he looked like. The office was behind a check-cashing store on Dorchester Avenue. A small room with a frosted glass door, 2 steel filing cabinets, and a spotless wooden desk without a single paper out of place. Arthur Pell rose when they entered. He wore a gray turtleneck sweater and thin framed glasses, his hair neatly combed, and he smiled the way a man might smile at customers who had come to open a savings account. He poured tea. 3 cups. He placed one in front of Faye, and she didn't touch it. "Miss Winslow," he said, reading her name as though it were a line in a ledger. "I know your file." "Yes," Faye said. "I know you do." Pell sat down, placed both hands on the desk, and turned to Cormac. "You've come because of the ledger. How many names?" 4,211. He spoke the number neither quickly nor slowly, without the slightest emphasis, as though reciting the dimensions of a room. "Those are the active accounts. There are more that have already been closed." Cormac looked at the 2 steel filing cabinets. "Do you know how many people in there are like her?" "I don't classify them that way." Pell took a sip of tea. "But if you're asking whether I know how many new accounts that debt transfer clause creates each year, I can answer immediately. I have the figures. I prepare quarterly tables." He set down his cup, his voice remaining perfectly polite. "You approved that clause, Mr. Brennan. I merely enforced it better than you expected." There was a moment when Faye glanced at Cormac and saw that his expression hadn't changed at all, and that was precisely what made her feel cold. Cormac opened his briefcase, removed a stack of papers, and placed them on the spotless desk. "Read them," he said. Pell put his glasses back on. He read the first page, and the courteous smile remained on his face. He turned to the second, and the smile was still there, but it had gone still. By the 4th page, he stopped turning. Cormac didn't need to explain. Every document had been drafted by Pell himself over the years. Binding clauses he had written to tighten around other people, now being read in reverse, line by line, and applied to the man who had written them. The house in Milton was held in the name of a company in which Pell didn't control a majority interest. The car was financed through a Brennan family entity. His ownership shares in 2 establishments became void if his employment was terminated for violating company rules, and Pell himself had written those rules in 3 lines on the final page. His retirement money was held in an internal fund whose charter permitted its recovery. One thing after another. Nothing had been overlooked. Arthur Pell removed his glasses. His hands rested on the desk, and for the first time that morning, they no longer lay flat. "You're taking everything," he said. "I'm not taking anything," Cormac said. "I'm only enforcing the terms, better than you expected." The ticking of the wall clock filled the room. Pell looked down at the documents, then raised his head, and something behind his eyes seemed to break very softly without making a sound. "I'm 68 years old," he said. "I know. What do you expect me to do now?" "You're keeping your job." Pell's head snapped up. "What?" "You keep your job," Cormac said. "You'll continue sitting at this desk, in this chair. Every morning, you'll arrive at 9 o'clock. He tapped a finger against the steel filing cabinet. "You'll open the ledger and start calling, one name at a time. You'll tell each person that the debt no longer exists, that they don't owe anyone a single cent, and that no one will ever call them about it again." Pell opened his mouth. No sound came out. "You'll call all 4,211 names," Cormac said. "You'll spend nearly a year doing it. And you'll listen to every one of them cry over the telephone. Some won't believe you. Some will make you repeat it 3 times. Some will ask who you are." He rose and buttoned his coat. "That is your entire sentence." He walked toward the door. Faye rose to follow him, and before leaving the room, she turned for one final look at the man sitting behind that spotless wooden desk. He remained in the same place with both hands resting on the surface, and his cup of tea was still steaming. They walked 2 blocks without either of them saying a word. The morning was bright, the sunlight thin, and traffic moved along the avenue as it did on any ordinary Friday morning in anyone else's life. Cormac slowed his pace to match hers. He thought she was searching for a way to thank him, and he was considering how he ought to respond. When they reached the corner, Faye stopped. She didn't turn toward him immediately. She stood watching the traffic with both hands in the pockets of her thin coat, and when she spoke, her voice sounded unlike anything he had heard from her before. "Do you know what I just saw in there?" "I know what you saw." "No, you don't." She turned toward him. "You think I saw justice. You think I finally witnessed the scene I've dreamed about all these years. The man who held my file lost everything in 15 minutes. No one had to lay a hand on him. No one raised his voice." She slowly shook her head. "That isn't what I saw." Cormac remained silent. "I watched you crush a man of 68 without your breathing changing by a single beat," Faye said. "You poured tea, placed those papers on the desk, said one sentence, and his life was over. Then you stood and buttoned your coat. I watched your hands while you fastened those buttons. They didn't tremble. She drew a breath. I need you to know that I saw it. I didn't see a man winning justice for me. I saw a man who was far too good at doing that. He had. I know what he did. Her voice rose for the first time. He took 4 years of my life. I hate him. I sat in that room and hated him so much that I didn't dare touch the cup of tea because I was afraid my hand would shake. But when you stood and walked out, I wasn't looking at him anymore. I was looking at you, and I was afraid. Cormac couldn't speak. Do you know what frightened me most? She said. It wasn't that you could do it. It was that doing it required no effort from you at all. That's who you are. That's what you do. You did it to him today, and 3 months ago, you did it to someone else whose name I don't know, and before that, you did it to someone else. She looked directly into his eyes. And you'll do it again, because that's how you keep your seat. He opened his mouth to tell her that he was changing, that the ledger would be closed, that he had already begun, but then he closed it again, because every one of those sentences was a promise. And this woman had spent her entire life living with promises made by men. I have a daughter of 6, Faye said. For the past few weeks, she has sat at that kitchen table grating you with smiling faces. She waits for you. Do you know that? Every afternoon, she asks me whether you're coming that day. Her eyes reddened, but she didn't cry. I can't let her become attached to the man I just saw in that room. I don't have the right to do that to her. Faye, and there's something else, she continued before he could interrupt. I don't want my daughter and me to become the place where you come to wash your hands clean. You're trying to atone for something. I understand that, and I don't blame you. But we aren't a church. You can't come to our home every week, so you can feel like a better man. That isn't fair to my little girl, and it isn't fair to you. Cormac stood on that street corner while 3 or 4 ways of persuading her passed through his mind, the same methods he had always used in closed rooms, and he knew every one of them would work if he chose to use it. That was precisely what she had just told him. He used none of them. All right, he said. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, took out the tiny glow in the dark plastic star that had been there since the night at the diner, and placed it on the flat top of the mailbox beside them, within her reach. It belongs to the little girl, he said. Then he turned away. He didn't wait for her to say anything else, didn't look back, and didn't offer a single word meant to leave a door partly open. He walked straight to the waiting car. Only after he had settled into the back seat and closed the door did he see it, the plastic star resting in his palm, and he couldn't remember when he had picked it up again. He sat motionless for a long time. Then he reached overhead, pressed it against the ceiling of the car directly above his seat, and held his finger there until it remained firmly in place. The driver glanced at the rearview mirror, then looked away. No one asked. No one said anything during the entire journey home. The news arrived on Monday afternoon through a Brennan man who worked at the ferry dock. He said someone in Charlestown was showing people a recording in which the Brennan boss went down on one knee on the floor of a diner. They were showing it in a closed room to small groups at a time, and they weren't charging money. Cormac listened to the entire report, then told the man to leave. He called the person responsible for the building's camera system. The answer came in less than an hour. A copy of the recording had been exported only once. The transaction had been logged, along with the name of the person who requested it. Cormac stared at the name on the screen for a long time, and he realized he wasn't surprised at all. It was the absence of surprise that made him feel tired. That evening, he summoned Des to the back room of the laundromat. Only the 2 of them. No one stood outside the door. Des entered and hung his coat on the hook as he had done for so many years, but this time he didn't stand in the corner. He pulled out a chair and sat across from Cormac. You found out, he said. You aren't denying it. Why would I? I signed my name in the log when I took the copy. I could have taken it without leaving any trace. You know I could. I left my name there. Why? Des placed both hands on the table. They were the hands of a man of 46 who had worked with them since he was 15. Because I wanted you to know it was me. Cormac said nothing. They didn't pay me anything, Des said. Go ahead and check. I didn't take a cent. I drove to Charlestown, handed it to old Halloran, had 1 drink with him, and came home. He looked up. Do you know why? Tell me. Because you're dying slowly, and you don't know it. Des leaned forward. Where have you been for the past 3 weeks? You've been sitting in a kitchen on the 3rd floor, waving your hands around with a child of 6. You missed 2 meetings. You sent Fitzy away without replacing him, and now there's no one overseeing the 3 locations to the south. You used your own money to purchase a debt and tear it up, and this entire organization saw it. Then you stripped Arthur Pell of everything in a single morning and left him in his job. He struck the table once with his palm, though not hard. Do you know what people are saying? They're saying the Brennan boss has gone soft. They're saying some waitress has him by the reins. So you gave the recording to outsiders. So I forced you to choose. Des spoke the sentence slowly, one word at a time. You went down on one knee in front of 40 men. Then the next day you slipped away to your Thursday night dinner like a boy sneaking past his mother. You don't dare call this thing by its name. If you keep holding it halfway in your mouth like that, it will kill you. If you want that girl, then you have to pay the price openly. You have to stand in broad daylight and pay it. Not hide at table 6 in the middle of the night. He lowered his voice. I held you when you were red from birth. I held you in that hospital before your mother could even get out of bed. I buried your brother. I carried him with my own hands. I won't stand by and watch you die because of a love you haven't even dared to name. Cormac sat motionless. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat, removed 4 folded pages, and placed them on the table. He didn't push them toward Des. He merely left them lying there between them. Des looked down. He didn't pick them up. What's that? A letter. From whom? A stranger, Cormac said. Written 1 week after Rory's funeral. I read it for the first time last week. Something passed across Des's face very quickly, and he concealed it at once, but not quickly enough. I'm going to ask you only one question, Cormac said, his voice still normal. Did he come to you? Did he tell you he wanted out? Des didn't answer. Did you advise him to keep quiet? Des opened his mouth. Then he closed it. He looked down at the 4 pages on the table, and his large hands slowly withdrew from the surface and came to rest in his lap. He said nothing. Beyond the room, the dryers turned with the same steady sound they had made for all those years, since the days when Cormac's father had sat in this very chair. Cormac allowed the silence to endure. Then he asked, How long have you worked for my family? Des's head snapped up. He knew. He had stood in the corner of this room and heard those same 3 questions dozens of times, over dozens of years, and he understood better than anyone what was happening. Cormac, so you think I don't count? Kid, listen to me. Here, or out in the hallway. Des sat perfectly still. Then he rose. He stood slowly, like a man who had suddenly grown old in the very act of standing, and took his coat from the hook. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He walked toward the door, and when he reached the threshold, he stopped without turning around. He did come to me, he said. One night, he sat in my car at the docks. He told me he wanted to leave all of this behind. His voice was painfully hoarse. I told him to forget it and not disappoint his brother. Then he pushed open the door, walked past the row of dryers, and went outside. 3 days later, word arrived from Charlestown. Fergus Halloran, the old man who had controlled that territory for decades, was preparing to hand it over. Their meeting had been set for Friday. After Friday, the man sitting at the head of their table would be his son, Emmett, a man everyone knew possessed none of his father's patience. Cormac looked at the calendar on the wall. He had only a few mornings left to speak with the father. He summoned the council on Wednesday morning in the dining room of the family home, beneath the walls without photographs. The 4 branch chiefs took their places at the table, and Maeve sat at the opposite end, saying nothing as she poured coffee. Cormac made his case in 4 minutes. He said the lending division would close. The entire portfolio would be bought back and converted into a legitimate credit fund, and everything had to be completed before the end of the week. The man responsible for the West Side objected first, interrupting before Cormac had even finished his sentence. The second man said that division supported 3 others. The third asked who would fill the hole it left behind, and the fourth, who spoke least of all, merely placed a hand on the table and said Cormac's father would never have done such a thing. Cormac let them finish. He didn't argue about morality. He didn't mention the names in the ledger, didn't speak of widows, and didn't mention any woman at all. Then he opened his briefcase, removed 4 thin files, and placed one before each man. No one opened them. The chief of the West Side glanced down at the cover of his file, then quickly raised his eyes. I know everything about every man sitting at this table, Cormac said. I know who is keeping money where, Who is paying whom, and who has an account his wife doesn't know about. That isn't a threat. It's what I do. I've done it every day since I was 21, because it's the only way to keep this family from tearing itself apart. He closed the briefcase. Now I need your votes. No one spoke. The quietest man was the first to nod. The price was placed on the table immediately afterward, and it wasn't small. To raise enough cash to buy back the entire portfolio before the deadline, the Brennan family would have to sell its harbor division, the most profitable part of the operation, the one his father had spent a lifetime building. When Cormac said it aloud, all 4 men fell silent. Maeve set down the coffee pot and looked at her son, without saying a word. On Friday morning, they met in a warehouse at the harbor, inside the very operation that would soon no longer belong to the Brennan family. A long table stood in the middle of the concrete floor. 4 men sat on one side and 4 on the other. No one carried a weapon. That was the rule. And the rule had existed before anyone on either side had been born. Fergus Halloran sat opposite Cormac, an old man in a heavy coat whose hand trembled slightly when he placed it on the table. A small hearing aid rested in his right ear. Beside him sat Emmett, a man in his 30s with his back straight, saying nothing and never taking his eyes off Cormac for a single second. They spoke for nearly an hour without making any progress. Fergus wanted the entire ledger. In the slow voice of a man who had spent 40 years sitting at tables like this one, he said the portfolio had been pledged as security for his family's money, that it was an asset rather than an idea, and that he didn't care what the Brennan family intended to do with its conscience. Cormac offered a figure. Fergus shook his head. Cormac offered the harbor division. Fergus remained silent for a long time, then said the harbor was worth only half. That was when the side door opened. One of Cormac's men stood there looking uneasy, and behind him was Faye in her thin coat. She hadn't been invited. No one knew how she had gotten there. Everyone at the table turned toward her. One of the Halloran men laughed. Cormac rose. In 13 years, no outsider had ever entered a room like this, and everyone knew what he was supposed to do now. He looked at her. Then he did something he had never done in any room in his life. He asked, "Do you want to come in?" Faye nodded. "Come in," he said. She approached the table, but she didn't sit. She stood at its head and looked at the old man across from her. "I could hear you from outside," she said. "You're fighting over 4,211 names. I used to be one of them." No one interrupted her. "You keep telling each other that the ledger has value. It doesn't. I know because my name was once inside it. People like me don't repay the people who threaten us. People like me run. We change our telephone numbers, move somewhere else, and work for cash without reporting it. You send letters and men who knock on doors, and you know exactly what percentage you actually recover." She placed a hand on the edge of the table. "For years, I paid one person on time without missing a single payment. The woman who owns the diner where I work. She has never threatened me once in my life. That was the only reason." Fergus Halloran tilted his head toward her and raised a hand to adjust the device in his ear. "Say that last sentence again," he said. Faye repeated it. The old man sat silently for a long time. Then he turned to one of his men and told him to bring paper and a pen. The deal was completed before noon. The entire portfolio would become a legitimate community credit fund, jointly held by the 2 families, with interest rates governed by state law and all accumulated penalty interest erased. The harbor division would belong to the Halloran family. When everyone rose, Emmett buttoned his coat and spoke the only words he had said all morning. In a calm voice, he told Cormac, "You're fortunate it won't be my turn to sit in this chair until next week." Then he walked out. Winter passed very slowly. Cormac didn't return to the apartment on the 3rd floor. He honored what she had said to him on that street corner, and he honored it the way a person keeps a difficult promise, which meant it wasn't easy or comfortable at all. He still came to the diner on Thursday nights, still sat at table 6, and Faye still poured his coffee as she had for all those years. They exchanged a few words, never many. One evening, she asked how far he had progressed, and he raised a hand and made a sign. She corrected his wrist, then moved on to another table. He continued attending the evening class at the Dorchester school twice every week. Miss Locke said he was the only person in the course who hadn't missed a single class, and she said it in the voice of someone who had just lost a small wager with herself. Other things happened too, one after another, quietly, during those ordinary weeks. Faye went to see Ruthie one afternoon when the diner was empty, carrying a document and an envelope. She had gone to the bank, asked questions until she understood everything, and spent 3 evenings with her calculator and expense notebook. She placed the document on the counter and said that beginning that month, she would make the payments on the mortgage Ruthie had taken out against the diner. She wouldn't repay everything at once. She would pay it month by month, one small, steady amount at a time, for many years. Ruthie pushed the document back and said the girl had lost her mind. Faye pushed it toward her again. "You carried me for years without saying a word," she said. "Now I'm going to carry you. With my own money." Ruthie opened her mouth to say something about Mr. Brennan, but Faye shook her head before the older woman could speak. "It isn't anyone else's money," she said. "It's mine. I want it to be mine." The old woman behind the counter stared at the document for a long time, then turned away and picked up a towel to dry glasses that were already clean. Across Dorchester Avenue, in the room with 2 steel filing cabinets, a man in a turtleneck sweater sat down every morning at 9 o'clock and opened the ledger. He called each number in turn. Some people hung up. Some made him repeat himself 3 times. Some asked who he was, and he answered exactly as he had been instructed. An elderly woman on the east side of the city fell silent for a long time after hearing the news, then asked whether she was dreaming. He made calls from 9 o'clock until the end of the afternoon every day, and by the end of spring, there was still an entire thick ledger waiting before him. There was something else too. Something Cormac learned only because Nell wrote it for him in her notebook one Thursday evening at the diner, in large letters followed by 3 exclamation points. "Mom teaches music. Miss." Locke had approached Faye one afternoon during a meeting with parents, after learning that Faye had once studied at a music conservatory and left before finishing. The school needed someone to lead an evening music class, a class that taught rhythm, vibration, and how to feel sound through a wooden floor and the body of an instrument. Faye had said she couldn't do it, that she had been away from her instrument for too long, and that she still worked 2 shifts. 3 days later, she called back and accepted. The performance at the end of the school year took place one evening in May, in the auditorium of the Dorchester School. The chairs were arranged in more than a dozen rows, and every seat was filled. Cormac arrived 5 minutes late, and sat in the final row beside the aisle. The lights dimmed. The curtain opened. More than 20 children stood on the stage in 3 rows, and Faye stood in the wings wearing a white blouse, one hand raised to count the rhythm. There was no music. Not a single speaker had been turned on. The entire auditorium was perfectly silent, and within that silence, more than 20 children began to sing with their hands. They sang together, moving in time, their hands rising and falling with a rhythm no one could hear but everyone could see. During one slow passage, dozens of small hands opened and closed together like breath. During a faster passage, the entire front row turned to one side on the same beat without a single child falling out of time. Someone in the audience drew a breath. Then someone else did the same. A man seated 2 rows ahead of Cormac bowed his head and covered his face with one hand. No one applauded before the end, because no one wanted to break that silence. Cormac sat motionless from beginning to end. Before the performance began, just after the lights dimmed and the children took their places, Nell had looked down into the audience and searched every row. When she found him in the back, she broke into a wide smile and raised her hand to make a single brief sign, then turned back toward the stage. He didn't understand it. He didn't know that sign. When he arrived home close to midnight, he opened the sign language dictionary he had bought during the winter and kept on his desk beside his other papers. It took him a long time to find the word because he had to remember the shape of her hand, its height, and the direction of her palm. He found it near the end of the book. The word was stay. At 6 o'clock on Sunday morning, the front door of the Blue Hour was still locked, but the kitchen lights were on. Ruthie stood behind the counter, polishing glasses that had already been spotless since the night before. She moved very slowly, and she didn't look outside even once, or at least she tried to make it appear that way. Faye arrived 5 minutes before 6 with Nell beside her, because she believed this would be breakfast like every other Sunday. The little girl wore a red coat and held her notebook against her chest. The moment the door opened, she was the first to see it, and she tugged at her mother's sleeve. On table 6 were 2 steaming cups of coffee. A glow-in-the-dark plastic star faded by the years, and beside them, a small box with its lid open. Cormac stood beside the table. He didn't kneel. He waited until Faye sat down, and she lowered herself into the chair very slowly without saying a word, while Nell climbed onto the chair beside her mother with her eyes wide. Then he began to tell them. He told them about a winter night several years earlier when he had walked without knowing where he was going until his legs could carry him no farther, and he had sunk onto an unfamiliar sidewalk, beneath a neon sign with one burned-out letter. He told them that someone had placed a cup of coffee beside him, then sat down at his side without asking who he was, what he did for a living, or wanting anything from him at all. He told them that he had spent so many winters sitting at this table without once looking up from his cup. He told them that what had made him the worst kind of man wasn't the things he had done, but all the years he had refused to look. Then he said he hadn't come to atone, because some things couldn't be atoned for, and he hadn't come to give her anything either. He had come to ask. Then he raised his hands. He signed slowly, one word at a time, exactly as Miss Locke had taught him, and exactly as a child of 6 had corrected him countless times at the kitchen table in the apartment on the 3rd floor. He made one sign wrong in the middle. He knew he had made a mistake the moment he finished it, and he stopped, intending to begin again. Nell sprang upright on her chair. She turned toward her mother and began interpreting, her hands flying up and down, her face as solemn as that of an interpreter performing the most important work of her life. When she reached the sign he had made incorrectly, she corrected it for him, then tapped 2 fingers against the table to make certain her mother was paying attention. Faye raised a hand to her mouth. She hadn't yet managed to say anything. Nell had already spun back toward Cormac, raised her hands, and signed the answer before her mother could, decisively and without asking anyone, as though she had settled this matter long ago and had merely been waiting for the adults to catch up. Then she folded her arms, satisfied. Faye laughed through her tears and said that her little girl was always faster than her mother. Afterward, she gave him her own answer in words, very softly. And from the kitchen came the sound of a glass striking the side of the sink. In the years that followed, people in the neighborhood still told this story like a legend, saying that a drunken boss had knelt in the middle of a diner and a waitress had said yes. They told it wrong. That drunken night hadn't created anything. It had merely exposed a truth that had been there for a long time, along with a habit one man had carried throughout his life. What made everything possible were the mornings that followed, the times he sat down and listened until the other person had finished, and the times he chose to ask before deciding. Love isn't measured by one grand gesture or one large check. It's measured by whether we're willing to ask what the other person wants, and by the ordinary choices we make afterward, day after day. And perhaps the most important thing to remember about this story is that no one ever needed to be repaired or made whole. What that person needed was simply for someone else to be willing to learn how to understand her. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with the people you love, so that every day we can gather to hear another story of kindness. How do you feel about Cormac and Faye? Do you believe a person should be measured by what they have done, or by what they choose to do after learning the truth? Please share your thoughts in the comments so we can hear the feelings that come from the deepest part of your heart. May you and your family always be blessed with good health, and may each passing day bring you peace and happiness. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next story.